Hello, everybody. I'm here today with Dave. And just as a reminder for those of you who may not have seen the earlier Dave videos, I first met Dave at a Jordan Peterson meetup, so we have some stuff in common there. I greatly admire his discipline and his enthusiasm for life. And he's kind of a polymath. He's a computer programmer, an artist, I guess I could say a gamer enthusiast.
Yeah.
Former astrophysicist, former medical student. So he has a very interesting history. And today we're going to talk about the general category of boundaries and how important they are.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have anything you want to say as an introduction, Dave, about boundaries?
So boundaries, I guess not really as an introduction. I'd love to hear where you go with it. I have always been interested in, I've been interested in boundaries in like different ways. It's kind of one of those things. It's like, oh, we're actually talking about boundaries. It kind of comes up in many different subjects. So I'd love to see what if you have any springboards. But I do also, I kind of was thinking about this yesterday, and I think that I've broken up my interest in boundaries into like 3 basic subjects. So that's one thing that I had in my head. But I'd love to hear your springboard topics or what you were thinking.
Well, I'll give you my general. I jotted down a few notes, and then we can look at your three breakups. Okay.
Yeah.
So boundaries can be thought of in many different ways. They can be thought of as psychological boundaries and how we have healthy boundaries for ourselves. In that case, we usually think of a boundary being a healthy limit of what is mine and what is yours, and where does my interest overlap with yours, and where is it important for us to have connections, but also important for us to each have our own space, and how to have healthy boundaries in relationships. And there's a great book by Henry Cloud and John Townsend called Boundaries, which goes into all of that. It's just an excellent book. And in there, they talk about boundaries being a matter of discipline in your use of time and thoughts and love and energy and money, and how you set healthy limits in those areas. Then you could also say we need to have healthy mental boundaries, that my thoughts are my thoughts. And I'm not going to intrude on you and force you to have my thoughts, but I also don't want you to intrude on me and force me to have your thoughts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can talk about boundaries in that sense. You can talk about boundaries in sense of your personal property. We have a boundary when we lock our door in our house at night because we don't want anybody intruding on our family space, somebody coming into our boundary. We don't want to go and take over somebody else's personal space. You can raise children with unhealthy boundaries if you're always bailing them out instead of helping them to learn to deal with the consequences of their own behavior. So that maybe they grow up with unhealthy boundaries around money and are always unwilling to live under limits, personal limits. We have national boundaries. I personally feel that national boundaries are very, very important for geopolitical stability worldwide, that if we get rid of boundaries, there won't be any, that's for a later part of the discussion maybe. So then you can also think about why boundaries are necessary. And one of the reasons that boundaries are necessary is to maintain the integrity of the contents within the boundary. And a good example of that would be to think of like a living cell.
Yep, that's exactly what
Yeah, cell is all organized inside, but if you break the outer limit of the cell and everything oozes out, you lose that organization and entropy takes over. So everything has boundaries: particles, atoms, molecules, cells, objects, human beings.
And I would even go so far as to say that it's almost like a definitional thing, which you just stumbled on. Is that so? Let's talk about the cell. if the cell ruptures and it, let's talk about it ruptures and nothing is spilled out of the cell. But now you have this like blood plasma. I don't remember the exact terms and stuff, but you have this stuff surrounding the cell and you have the stuff inside the cell, and there's effectively no barrier between. And so there's no real distinction between the two. And I know that's a really um, extreme form, but in a few seconds, there really will not be a distinction between the two. And so you approach the question of, is this a cell anymore? So is the fact that this lost its boundary, is it doing its function at all anymore? Or did it cease to do its function as soon as it left its boundary? And if that's the case, then everything we're looking at is no longer really a cell. It's more like the blood plasma or whatever the cell was surrounded by. So we've changed the object entirely as soon as its boundary was changed or was removed. So I like that idea too, is that it kind of goes hand in hand with the object we're talking about.
Well, so boundaries also define limits. And one of my favorite Bible verses is Jeremiah 5:22. I mean, it's one that I think about a lot. I really contemplate this, where God is speaking and he says, I made the sand a boundary for the sea. And first time I read that, it had a deep healing meaning to me, because I was in a really traumatic time of life when my whole world was crashing in on me. And the idea that the sand was the boundary for the sea, that in the latter part of the verse, it says, no matter how much the waves may crash and roll, they cannot overcome it. So the sand is never overcome by the sea. And when you stop and think about it, the sea is this massive, dominant, powerful force. And the sand is this passive, receptive, it just takes it in. It's malleable. It may change its form. It may change its shape a little bit, but it remains the sand. It keeps its integrity in spite of that. So that started me thinking about what is the nature of boundaries and what are appropriate boundaries meant to be like. And let's go back to the cell. Even a cell has not a hard boundary. Right?
It has an appropriate boundary.
Osmosis, there can be things flowing in and out that are appropriately flowing in and out, that are meant to, that have the purpose of that. There are connecting places, obviously, because the cell sits inside of whatever it's in, whether it's the plasma surrounding it or whatever. So it's connected to that stuff, but also separate from it. So a boundary has to have this connecting feature as well. And so then if I take that up to the national level and I think about nations, if each nation has its own culture and borders and language, and it has an integrity within its own nation, then those nations can have gateways with other nations. They can have trade agreements with other nations. They can have connecting places with other nations, but then they all function within their own uniquenesses, and they make a more diverse world in the end than if everything becomes the same. One of the things I think about is how we're losing the integrity of our communities, because now there is like no limits. Every place you go, there's a Home Depot and a Target and a Walmart, and everything has become the same. We've just washed out all of the vital, unique
the differences between each location. Yeah, I see that too, and I don't think it alarms me, but maybe it should. I do think, it's I don't know what to make of it, but I definitely think that it's unfortunate. I would rather. So I'm a big prescriber of what I call it the four corners of the world, just to simplify things. But like what I like to think of is every group of people gets to. I don't want everybody to become the same gray population. I want every group to express their unique corner of the world as vibrantly as they possibly can, and be able to express it without stepping on other people's heels and stuff. And so I 100% agree with the boundaries. I would add the word accountability to boundaries. So the thing that I always remember is, we have sidewalks and street lines for a reason, and it really is kind of a suggestion, but it adds accountability to the thing. If I'm standing in the middle of the street and I get hit by a car, my accountability is pretty questionable, So that's only there because we enacted a boundary that we didn't need to go that detailed into it. We had the pavement, we had everything ready, everything was moving just fine. But just in case something were to go wrong, we already had a boundary there. And so that's my big thing with boundaries, and I think that goes to the national level where, I'm okay with various implementations of walls and whatnot. And if you don't want a wall, okay, sure, like let's talk about that. If you do want a wall, okay, let's talk about that. My big thing is just accountability. We need some sort of system that says, really, I think that this the basic for accountability, and this kind of goes from a tech point of view, is I really do think that everybody should be registered to some degree. Like just everybody should have some sort of ID, North American ID.
Really? You really
yeah.
did that? Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
no, absolutely. And if you don't want to live on if you want to live off the grid, that's fine. But I think that should be also a tier of its own.
No, so maybe I misunderstood you when you said that. When you said everybody needs to be registered, all of a sudden I saw Big Brother flashing. But then after you said
everybody
ID, I thought, oh, maybe it's not that big a deal.
Yeah, no, exactly. So like everybody does think Big Brother, and admittedly, I'm totally one of those people who, like, I'm a little naive with that kind of stuff. So maybe.
But when you say national ID, you just mean just having an ID that you use for everything.
Yeah, and I mean, you don't even need to use it for everything. It's just that, like, there should be a number that I can look up and say, oh, Dave Nair. Like, and I don't need to find you or anything like that. I just need to be able to say, like, yeah, we have him in our books. He's a guy, and he's supposed to be American. Is he up to something? Like that's it. Like, it doesn't need to be a tracker or anything like that. But I do think that the base level of holding everybody accountable is that Americans should have IDs, and like illegal Americans should have IDs. And I don't think that they should. This is where I think that people get really upset with the IDs thing, is like, I'm not talking about punishing people who have been illegal or anything like that. I just want to get everybody a number. Just mail every person a number, every baby a number, and then we'll start from there. And then we can move forward. Like, and I know that.
So how is that different than Social Security, though? I mean,
it is effectively Social Security, and so yeah. I would want people to be added onto the Social Security numbers. And I think until we have every single person not every single person accounted for, but until that's the objective, until we say, like, okay, we're going to expand, and I don't know if that's the problem, but I am saying that, like, it seems very obvious to me that before we start shipping people around, before we start saying you can't be here, you are supposed to be here, you're not supposed to be here, that person's supposed to have an ID number. Like, that person cannot be referred to as just a genealogy and stuff like that from now on. Like, we need to start with a 0.0 and say they're here now, and we're starting a registry now, and, like, if you want to stay here, that's fine, but we just have you in our books. That's it. And again, it's the groundwork, but I think that that's and I think that it answers a lot of other questions too, like gun security and stuff can be based off of an ID and stuff. And I'm not going to get into, I haven't thought about gun security very much. I don't want to.
That's not something I want to go into.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into that. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, so tell me what your 3 categories of boundaries are.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting because, so you actually, earlier when we were talking, you had mentioned the social aspect of boundaries, which is something that I've always kind of internally, it's always been perplexing to me, kind of interesting to me. I don't think I've not been a very good, I don't know, one-on-one kind of person. I don't know what I'm saying. So social interactions have not been my forte for much of my life. So I would love to talk a little bit more about those boundaries, the social boundaries that you're talking about. But I did think that kind of the 3 that I broke it down into was, so the one that I think is it's kind of easiest to talk about, but everybody likes to talk about a lot, is the cultural boundaries. And so I kind of talked about the all four corners of the earth kind of idea. But then there's also, so, there's this idea of multiculturalism, which I think plays into it. I don't want to specify my exact belief on multiculturalism. I think it is pretty simple, but I just don't want to put it into words right now. But one thing that I did want to kind of point out is that, like, so in terms of boundaries, in terms of cultural boundaries, I think I might share my screen in a second because I'm going to bring this up if I can find it. Yeah, so there's a really easy thing to do in AI. It's not easy, but it's like a very common thing to do. It's called clustering. And, all you do is you give it a bunch of data points and you ask it to group them together as best as it can. And there's many different algorithms to do it. So there's, if we look at, like, there's many different ways you could cluster groups of people across the world culturally. So we could call it culturally, we could call it locationally, whatever you want to call culture. So for instance, you could maybe make an AI that would tell you what the average North American looks like or something like that. And I'm sure that it would be different than what the average blah, blah, blah looks like, and et cetera, like that. So first off, I just want to point out that there are many interesting ways we could define boundaries, like literally with data sets, and we could make numbers on it and say that, 96% of people dropped off as soon as we included them in this data set or something like that, and say that that's our boundary. One visual way of showing that is we have all these genealogy tests. Now, this is not boundaries based on facial structure. This is boundaries based on DNA. But what you can do is, everybody has some sort of genealogy. And if you ask an AI to cluster that genealogy using whatever thing that they do, there are maps you can find for that. Oh, okay. Yeah, I will. Yeah, so I was gonna share something, but you can find a map for it. And if you go to Google Images.
You want me to set it up so you can share screen?
Yeah, if you don't mind, that'd be great.
Just let me pause a second and I'll take care of it.
Cool. Yeah, so here you can see this is Ancestry's official genealogy map. And so what they did is they just took all the different DNA that they've been getting and clustered them. And so you can see some interesting clusters. So for instance, you can see that this is effectively one massive population of genes that are very similar. And then we can see in Europe, we have different sectors. So we have this kind of peninsula area, and then we have the Balkans, and we have this kind of Russian area. And then first thing I noticed was that India was its own thing. These are also scientific boundaries that, again, these are kind of touchy boundaries. People don't like to talk about them, but this is from ancestry.com. This is just genes being clustered together. And so this is also particularly interesting to me. These kind of different, I don't know what this is from. I don't know the history of Africa, but there seems to be some sort of clustering going on along these coasts of Africa and stuff like that. And then this is also interesting that you don't really see a cluster originating from Australia. So I just kind of wanted to point out that there's boundaries that come about from AI clusters. And so that's my overarching point. And then lastly, the second point, second overarching point, and I'll stop sharing, is the point you kind of hit on, is I called it the personal level, which involved physiological, psychological, and social boundaries. So physiological boundaries just always fascinated me, like out-of-body experiences and stuff like that. Or I've heard of people there's somebody I heard who, I think she had a stroke or something like that, and she lost a part of her brain that interpreted the edge of her body. So she always felt like a cloud or something like that from then on. And so that always interested me, is that we have our own interpretation of our bodies. The five senses play into that. And then one that I really like, even though it's a touchy subject, we don't have to talk about this, but I think the boundaries go very much into identity, not politics, identity as in like gender identity and nonconformist identity, where I think I've talked to you about this before. My simple idea is that when I'm interacting with somebody, there's an agreement happening right there between you and the outside world and between me and the outside world. And you happen to be part of the outside world and I happen to be part of the outside world. And if you are portraying, like, you have to match that agreement to some degree. So if I'm down talking you, then yeah, I'm not matching that agreement. I'm being bad about that agreement. But if you're not even matching the agreement and you're getting upset about it, this is a problem. And going to the boundaries issue is that I think that people need to recognize that there are two boundaries there. One where there's me, and let's say that I feel internally like a woman. That is okay in my book. I'll say okay in my book. I don't want to get into that, but like that's a-okay if it's an internal thing. But then you also need to realize that there's a second layer where you're interacting with the rest of the world. And I do agree that they need to show you respect. But let me give my girl example. If I'm dressed like this and I get mad that somebody's not calling me she, that's on me, because I didn't match that expectation and I didn't let the rest of the world know at that boundary level, at the second boundary with my clothes. And so that's where I first thought about this. Is in anthropology, we once talked about, anthropology is a subject that I wanted to get a minor in, but then I got my major and I was done with college. And so in anthropology, we talked about the importance of clothes. And, on one level, it's a very practical thing that I can wear a watch and I can be a little flashy one day and stuff like that. On another level, it's telling the third party exactly what I want you to know. And that's an agreement, So to shirk that off and then to get mad at the third party, I'm sorry, I keep going back to identity stuff. I should be talking about the boundary, but we talked about in anthropology that, if I choose to wear earrings to my interview, that's the level of boundary that I'm setting. I'm saying, hey, I'm an earrings kind of guy. That's my first impression I want you to see. And this is the extent at which my first level of boundary kind of ends. I can't control anything beyond that. So I thought that was a really interesting thing. And then I'll just wrap up really quickly. This is something that I think everybody, it comes out naturally. It's part of the physics background, but obviously boundaries are a very important thing in physics too. And so I'm happy to discuss that a little bit too. I'll just give you a quick word you should totally look up, which is Fermi energy levels. And Fermi energy levels are really simply put, just like if you can imagine the atom, like an atom. I think these might be specifically for metals, but maybe not. You can imagine a copper atom or something like that, and it sits next to another copper atom. You could imagine there's kind of a visual representation of how much they're messing with one another and how much they're willing to mess with things around them. And so those are the Fermi energy levels. And so there's different energy levels. And what you would effectively say is that once you've surpassed a certain activation and you're at a certain range, you've passed that energy level and you're within the boundary of that thing. So that's a very physicsy way of saying when two things have crossed each other's boundary, is when one Fermi energy level has overlapped with another's Fermi energy level. And it's effectively saying, hey, I'm this energetic, I'm also this energetic, So that's one thing I wanted to point out. And then another thing that I think is much more important than the Fermi energy level idea. But this is, again, a very physics way of thinking about it. I think it applies in most situations, but you have to be kind of careful lest you kind of get nihilistic and throw away the answer. But in astrophysics, something you have to immediately come to grips with is scale. And there's things that are on the small end of the spectrum and there's things on the big end of the spectrum. Like subatomic particles are on the small end of the spectrum, and then massive galaxy clusters and I can't remember the other term right now, are on the other side of the spectrum. And so it's interesting to think where we lie in there and just how massive that spectrum is, how large the scales grow. Now, one thing that I immediately picked up, I don't think it's like a specific rule that you learn in astronomy or anything like that, but error bars are a big deal in astronomy. And that's because it goes hand in hand with the concept of scale. And like anytime you ask a question, so that's another funny thing, is that I don't think boundaries really mean anything unless you're answering something or defining something. So it's just all there until you say, what's that? And then you say the boundary of that object. And so in this case, in astrophysics, one thing I learned is that you basically always have to ask, to what scale does it matter? So there's the age-old question is, am I touching my finger? You know, like the electrons are not supposed to touch. So am I actually touching my finger? And so the question is simply, to what scale are you asking? Are you asking to the point where my fingers are pushing against each other and they feel it? Because yeah, obviously I'm touching. Are you talking about to the point where two electrons are on top of each other and we're ripping apart reality at the seams of my fingertips? That's probably not occurring right now. So it's really a matter of scale. And this isn't specifically boundaries, but I did realize that a lot of deep metaphysical questions need to be immediately answered with, to what scale are you talking about? Because otherwise it's a meaningless question. We could always go deeper and deeper and deeper. That's that Achilles problem, which you could solve with calculus, but that's only because calculus is designed to go infinitely deep. And so if you can't go infinitely deep, which most real life things you cannot, you need to ask, to what scale does this matter? And then you have your boundary immediately.
Well, and I love where calculus ties into it, because calculus brings in the one and the many, because it seems like the whole setup is based on the one and the many and the boundaries.
Very true. Yeah, absolutely.
The whole universe, you could break it down into that. And the beautiful thing I love about the calculus picture is that the asymptote is always approaching but never reaching. So I think there's a lot of deep meaning in that. But I want to go back to a couple of things that you said, because you brought up some very interesting issues. One, you were talking about the woman who had some sort of a medical issue where she lost her sense of her own edge.
Yeah.
That she felt like she was a cloud. I've been reading this really weird book that was written probably 50 years ago by the guy by the name of Douglas Harding. And it reads kind of like he was on some kind of acid trip or something.
Okay.
But it's called The Hierarchy of Heaven and Earth. And in this book, he's laying out the whole structure of the universe. And it's kind of fascinating to me, because I've been thinking about this stuff for the last few years. And then I start reading his book. I'm like, oh, this guy was thinking about this 50 years ago. So nothing new under the sun, I guess. But anyway, his thinking, when I've only gotten in about 50 pages, and in the first 50 pages, he's talking about, what is my center? How do I even have a head? Because I never see my own head unless I'm looking in a mirror or looking online. But I see another person's head, because when I'm looking at you, I see your head. And the minute I'm looking at your head, I'm recognizing something about you, and I'm connecting with you in some sort of a way, because I am looking at you. There's automatically, every time I look at another person, there's a kind of a projection. I'm projecting something of myself onto them, because I'm imagining that I understand something about them. So I'm projecting some of my own mental energy onto them. And at the same time, you're projecting something onto me. You're identifying something about me. So there's always this connection that goes on when you're looking at another person. So there is the me that is inside my own head, imagining who I know that I am and who I think that I am. But there's also the me that's inside all the other people that are out in the universe that are looking at me. And all of them have a different picture of who I am. There might be a million different pictures of who I am. So I'm sort of distributed equally out.
Sure. Yeah. And you're kind of getting
think about her cloud thing, right?
And you're also getting to that kind of second layer I was talking about, where it's the agreement, and you're hitting a point where it is very tricky navigating that layer, because you're being interpreted by so many different people and stuff like that. That's why I always had a soft spot for musicians, because I feel like their entire careers are dictated by that second layer of, do you like me enough to pay me, or do you not? Do you need me still? And so it's a very weird, washy field. But you're absolutely right, and that's again where the clothing thing came into play. Is that's kind of your last attempt to give the right impression to everybody around you. Not to put a lot of stress on clothing, but
Well, that's where boundaries and edges start to kind of fade into one another. Um, and not just edges, but the idea of a boundary also links up with the idea of a margin that's on the outer limits of something. When you get to the outer limits, that's the margin, and that kind of connects up with the boundaries. But before I get back to the edges, because I have some paintings I wanted to show you that I was looking at where people deal with edges differently. I thought it might be interesting to look at that.
sure.
Before I get to the paintings and the edges, I wanted to go back to this thing where you're talking about social identity and social accountability and how you rise up to the level of what the expectations are and so forth. I was thinking about this the other day in terms of economics, and I haven't thought it all the way through, so my thinking may have a lot of holes in it, so feel free to throw in there. But in free market economics, there's this idea that price signals are cognitively distributed throughout all of the people that are participating in an economy. That the way that we deal with scarcity is that when something starts getting more expensive, people just buy less of it. So you don't need some guru at the top who knows everything in order to set prices. You just need people acting based on their own self-interest, and they'll make decisions based on their local information. People have much more information at the local level than anybody can have at a central level. So I was thinking about this issue with prices, and I was thinking, so maybe our values and our social interactions work the same way. That I behave in a certain way. Let's say I want to say I love a certain person. They have an option to either receive or not receive my love. They can either buy or not buy. If I what other level besides love? Let's say I want to be famous. People can either buy or not buy, and if they don't buy, I'm not going to be famous. So there's any number of things on the value structure where I'm putting out, I'm making a bid, and then people are either choosing or not choosing to accept my bid. And I'm receiving bids from people all the time, and I either choose or don't choose to receive their bid. And somehow in this way we are, and maybe this goes back to what Jordan Peterson was talking about before, where he says we outsource our sanity, that we're always kind of watching other people to see how they react to the things we say or don't say, to recognize whether or not we're kind of within the realm of what it means to be human, or have we gone over the edge into some psychotic thing that we shouldn't be wandering down that road. So we sort of outsource our sanity, but I think we also outsource our values to a certain extent, that the way other people interpret our value bids makes a difference on the values that we set up. Like I said, I haven't thought it all the way through. So it was something that I started thinking about when you were talking about how people dress or how they behave or how they identify themselves. And then they demand other people to accept them the way they are, and yet they perhaps are not being as accepting of the bids of others that may be different than theirs. So, these things have to work. For society to work, it has to work both directions, right?
So I think I missed the first 50% of what you said, but I did catch the end, and I think I'm totally on board, and I agree. Where it's kind of, well, one thing that comes to mind with that, and correct me if I'm off this topic with this, but it kind of feels like the what's it called? Peterson talks about a phrase. people have not found heaven because they don't look low enough or something like that. And what the way that reminds me is that you know, I myself have had to remind myself that, you know, sometimes in my times of struggle or loneliness, sometimes I have to remind myself, wait a minute, but you know these people who are right there ready for you to talk to them. You just are painting yourself over these other things. So I would say that uh, I guess I'm approaching it from a kind of opening up perspective. Yeah, I guess I'm getting a little off base with the boundary issue. So one,
No,
I'll
no,
say,
no, no. Opening up is also, yeah. So here's the thing. Let me go into physics for just a second, because um, boundaries, to be healthy, I think, cannot be too loose,
mm,
too big, and also cannot be too tight, too
mm,
small, too constricting. And as I said, they have to have gateways and fuzzy edges and connections and all of that. But I watched this video of a female physicist talking about, she was particle physics, and she was talking about a lot of experiments that she and her team had done using these teeny tiny particles that were synthetic. So they're all exactly the same size and the same
mm,
shape. And she did it with different types of shapes of particles. She did some that were round, she did some that were polygons. And the experiment that they ran was that they put all these particles in some sort of container, and then they began to remove space from around the container, or from around the particles. And as they removed space, in other words, as they made the boundary smaller and smaller, she didn't say that. She just said, we're removing space. She said at a certain point, the particles automatically organize into a perfect crystalline structure. And then she made the comment and she said, and now this was strictly based on entropy and nothing else. And I was listening to her and I said, no, it wasn't just based on entropy. You changed the boundary.
yeah,
When you change the boundary, that makes a difference in how things organize, because Jordan Peterson is always talking about order. And when order becomes too rigid, when the rules become too restrictive, the order becomes too rigid, and then there's not the flexibility that's needed to keep it fresh and alive. And I think that works at the particle level as well, because once you freeze into a crystalline structure, all the information is now gone. There's no more new information available there. It's frozen, right?
yeah, and well, so you do hit a very good point in that, like, you know, I had actually kind of completely forgotten about crystalline structures, but that is a good point that there's a very intricate moment with the boundary that's like kind of crossed and almost never returned from. You know, it takes an extraordinary amount to bring it back from that. You pushed it to that level that it assumed a new form. It assumed a new structure. I've always been fascinated by crystals, but from a very structural point of view. So we call it solid state physics, and that was what I was really into back then. But only like basic solid state physics. But I also think that the boundary question is a very specific thing that happens with crystals at a certain moment. So, you know, triple points and stuff like that are very interesting. If you look at I can't remember what they're called, but there's a map that basically states how an object, how much pressure versus how much temperature it takes for objects to be either a gas, a solid, or a liquid. And some objects, I can't remember what the ratio is, but some objects have a thing called a triple point, where there's technically a pressure and temperature, where if you just hold it there, you'll see it rapidly go between liquid, solid, gas, liquid, solid, gas. And so you can find videos of water doing it.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And let me see if I can pull one up. It's usually super quick, but if I can't, it's fine. But and it's yeah, Yeah, cool. So yeah, I'll share my screen real quick and just show this video real quick. So here's the triple point of water. Oh, cool, Santa Cruz, nice. And yeah, so you'll see the pressure drops, and you'll see that this ice, basically you'll just start to see it start. Yeah, it's both boiling and freezing at the same time. And so this is the water reaching its triple point. It's quite boring in my opinion to watch, but it's a weird phenomena that's happening because like there's sublimation where something goes from solid straight into gas. There's other things I can't remember. I guess condensation and stuff like that where they go from the other way around. But this is the triple point where it's literally all three things are. I mean, all two stages are two transformations are happening from water to gas and from water to solid and vice versa. It's just all happening wild.
That is amazing.
Yeah. And so that's one interesting thing with boundaries and thermodynamics. And again, this goes back to the atomic structure of things, and just this is something each particle has its own way of doing things. Water is super unique, as you could probably imagine. So that is one neat way to point out the physics side of things. Oh yeah, I did also want to point out that one interesting thing that comes up with boundaries is that in physics, in astrophysics, we talk about pressures a lot. And pressure is a kind of weird term that a lot of people don't like to talk about, but most people know pressure as force divided by area. But if you take a look at those units, you actually realize that another way of talking about pressure is rather than force on an area, it's actually a certain amount of energy that's within a volume. And so one way to think about that is you have a car window and you have some pressure, air pressure on that window. And we like to say that that's the force of the air divided by the area of the window. But now let's talk about the full car itself and each of those windows. And let's crank up the temperature of the car. Now we have really energetic air on the inside, and we have this surface area around the outside. Now we know the pressure building up inside of the car. And so pressure is just energy inside of a boundary. And so unfortunately, when we're taught in 7th grade, we're taught that P equals F over A, and we don't really get the boundary aspect of it. But the reason it comes up in astrophysics all the time is because it's easier to talk about things in terms of pressure rather than how big it is and how much energy it has inside of it. And so we talk about things in terms of pressure. And I guess my main point is just that the fact that pressure comes up in a field as big as astrophysics, that literally sometimes you're just summing up everything in the universe. The fact that we talk about things in terms of pressure, I think kind of gives a testament to how important it is that we at least infer boundaries into our understanding. We assume the boundary aspect into our calculations, that we're never talking about a universe that's 10 kiloparsecs big. We're always saying a universe is this big because it has this much area within that period, if that makes sense.
So I have an astrophysics question that, and I haven't heard anybody say this. I have thought it, and I don't have any idea if I am correct, or, I mean, maybe I did hear somebody say it in a dream someplace, but it seems to me that if you accept the idea of the Big Bang and that the universe at some point in time began moving outward, and I've seen pictures, I mean, they have graphic representations of what that looks like. It's kind of like this weird bell shape, and it's kind of stretching out more now.
Yeah.
That means that to me, the limits of the universe, the outer limits of the universe right now, the boundary of the universe at this point is time, isn't it?
Oh, so that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. So I'll say this.
Because this is the now, and then the next moment is going to be a little bit bigger in the next moment from now, and that's the unknown out there. So we're pushing into.
So to that degree, yes, you're 100% correct. But I would say one thing, and this is something that they unfortunately don't bring up much, but there's really no reason to. Anytime we talk about the universe, we really should be saying the observable universe. And that boundary you're talking about is actually the observable boundary. And so there's a universe beyond that boundary. but the observable boundary is totally bound by time. We're waiting for that boundary to get bigger. But that is the difference between the observable universe and the unobservable universe, which we can't draw any conclusions on. That's the unfortunate part about it. That's the other reason we never talk about the unobservable universe.
Well, so the unobservable universe would necessarily have to be future then.
No, not necessarily. It would be effectively a concurrent timeline. It would be happening at the same time as us, but what we say is it's causally, it's non-causally linked. So anything that happens in our timeline has nothing to do with that timeline, but they're happening at the same time. That's a very basic way of thinking about it. There might be something else happening on the other edge. It might just be blackness on the other side, or it might be running in reverse. One weird thing that we've noticed is that we can't seem to find antimatter anywhere. Like, we're supposed to find just as much matter as antimatter, but for some reason we find way more matter, like way more matter than antimatter. So one theory is that, like, somewhere in some direction, there's just a huge bunch of antimatter that's just sitting there, and it's like an antimatter universe. I don't really buy into that theory, but my bigger point is that, A, we have no way of talking about the unobservable universe, and B, the most layman's way of thinking about it is that just like the events happening in my neighbor's house and the events happening in my house, they are just happening, and I just don't get to see them. They're just both happening at the exact same time, and I just don't get to know what's happening. So that's the most basic way to view the unobservable universe. But my friend and I once had a conversation. I can't remember how we got to this point, but we were talking about that boundary. And for one reason or another, we debated whether time dilation happens at that boundary. And effectively, the question becomes a moot question. But I don't remember how we got to that point. Honestly, I think that was just us being weird and just like saying, oh, what about this? What about that? But it's the unobservable universe. We can't do anything about it. But the observable universe, yes, technically we are literally just waiting for more of it to reveal itself to us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And one of the other things I always found interesting in listening to astrophysicists talk is that when they talk about scale, and I don't remember the scale, but it's something like the universe is 10 to the 35th power or something beyond here, and the micro scale is 10 to the minus 35th or something like that.
Okay.
So humans are actually right in the middle, which is really counterintuitive when you think about it, because we're so tiny compared to the vastness of the universe.
I definitely thought we were on
small
the
scale is also so tiny compared to us that
one thing I wanted to point out that you kind of said before, and this is my weird, crazy, not theory really, but it's just my weird understanding of light. And I think this kind of goes to something you said earlier, but you called it time. And so there's this weird idea that light is the fastest thing in the universe. And I always thought that was an odd thing to say, but it comes in other ways too. So light is the only massless particle that's in the universe, and particles are just placeholders. Like, really, a particle is just an event that happens somewhere. Like, the way I like to say it is that sometimes my students don't really believe me, but I ask them, what's the color of a proton? Like, what's the shape of a proton? It's not a circle. It's not blue. It's an event that we have a localization for. We call it a proton, and it has a certain size at which that event seems to taper off. So all of these things are just kind of like popcorn events, that some of them linger much longer than others. So light is unique in that it doesn't have a mass. If you think about it as an event, it doesn't have a mass. So everything becomes like double quotes when we talk about particles, but it doesn't have a mass. And as a consequence, it can move faster than anything, and yada, yada, yada. And it was always really weird to me. But one thing I kind of realized, going with this kind of causal idea, is that if a light particle has not reached me yet, okay, so first off, if a light particle has not reached me yet, has it happened? So obviously on a mental level, no, it hasn't happened yet. But like, even on an event level, if the universe were to end tomorrow, between those two distant things, did that thing ever happen? Maybe not. Maybe the information is part of the event happening. But here's the other, I got kind of sidetracked. Let me say the thing that I really, really dug me into a weird idea. When light moves, when light propagates, so we imagine when we see light bending in water and stuff like that, the like official reason for that is that light is choosing the shortest path, and what it's effectively doing is it's one way to think about it is that it has radiated outwards from its point of origin in all directions, and then it is revealing itself to you in the shortest path that happened. So every single direction happened simultaneously, and then for some reason it collapsed on one specific path. That's kind of one weird way of thinking about it. And so one weird conclusion you could draw from that is that light knows the path to follow. Light a priori already knows the thing to do. And it's not really a priori, but the conclusion I drew is that effectively light, and if you follow the path of light, if you were to kind of sit on a photon and watch the universe as you were to move along the photon, light is almost like a refresh rate for the universe, where as light moves, as that amount of time passes, so as the observable universe expands, we can officially say that that event happened and that information is being passed. And so one weird way of thinking about it is that if light is literally the fastest thing in the universe, then it also represents kind of when something happened, like the earliest something could have possibly happened is determined by the shortest amount of time that light took. And so I like to think of light and time as very interchanged and very correlated, and that light is effectively like an idealized version of time and space working together, and it's like the refresh rate at which the universe is operating. That's the way I think of light and its movement. And I for some reason that it seemed really synonymous with your idea of the observable universe expanding with time. But now
I love that idea. That is I can totally go there. Now, I'm not a physicist, but just with the picture that I have in my head, that I can totally go there. Now, I would like, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to throw a few things at you that have to do with the Bible.
Sure, yeah.
So the Bible says that Jesus is the light of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And Bible says that in him all things hold together. And the Bible says that in the beginning, he was, I should actually read it to you, because I knew this physicist in Iowa who, when he read this verse, just jumped up and down shouting "Eureka!" and it was an amazing thing to see. He got so excited because it had to do with a question that he had been asking himself for a long time since he had started his study of physics. He told me that he had been laying in bed at night pondering black holes, because black holes absorb light endlessly, and they've been absorbing light endlessly forever. So how is it that there's still any light in the universe? And so he had been pondering that for a long time. And here's the verse that so it says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. And then a little bit later, it goes on to say, there was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So this is from the first chapter of John, and it lays out that Jesus is the light, and that he was the Word of God that spoke the worlds into being, and that he has come into the world in the flesh, in the person of Jesus Christ. And so when you say that light knows the path to take, of course he knows the path to take, because he is the author of light. He is the author and perfecter of the universe. And so that's totally great. But I do have a question about photons, because if light is the only massless particle, why is it that a photon, when it can hit something like those little tiny little fans that are inside a vacuum, and when the light hits one side of it, it will start to turn inside there, because the photon has a pressure. How can that be?
Yeah, so radiation pressure. So effectively what's happening is, and I could be wrong on this, but I do also want to correct one little thing. I was worried we were going to get into this territory, but then you totally navigated away from it, so I didn't need to worry at all.
Because I don't know anything.
Yeah, but, I should mention that most of what I was saying before, I should have used the word photon, and they are pretty much interchangeable, light and photon. But I do like to reserve, light is a very awe-inspiring metaphysical concept. And so I do like to reserve light for kind of the overarching idea. And I kind of should have been saying photon that entire time. Although I would also just add in that I don't think that I do like to make the separation that a photon travels along a line that light has determined. So there's still this a priori determining, and then a photon, kind of pinballs down that thing. Now, to answer your question about radiation, and I could be wrong about this, but I believe the idea is that, so there are two different things that photons can do when they hit something. One is they could, I guess one of these things is like two small things happening at the same time. They could get either absorbed or they could get reflected. And reflected is a little confusing, because I remember for a long time, I think I had the wrong idea of reflection. Yeah, let me just take a look at that real quick. But the one other thing is, I do know that sometimes these are just cases of absorption and re-radiation, but that's right. It's because it's a yeah. So effectively, what'll happen is so we were talking about I forgot about this entirely. We talked about air and water and how light will bend in water. And so you could imagine an extreme version of bending where the substance, it bent in water because light is very easy to transverse and water is not super easy to transverse. And so it effectively bent because it got slowed down. And you could imagine a version where it gets so slowed down that it can't continue. And so that's reflection. And reflection involves a few different things. Some of it does continue. It's kind of like I don't know, a shotgun hitting a wall at an angle. So some things will go in, some things will bounce off. And so that's the reflection, and that bouncing does give some momentum loss. That's at least the way that I would think about it off the top of my head. And then re-radiation is also a potential thing, but re-radiation I think happens in all directions. So I don't think that would move you in a specific direction. But some things will absorb the light and then kind of radiate it outwards. I'm struggling right now to think of a good example. But yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the.
So even though they're massless, they do carry some force.
Yeah, and so that's another interesting thing is that if you look at what is it? Oh, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, the energy of a photon is the formula is just h times frequency, yeah, that's exactly it. So it would be more. Oh, so this actually goes back to our idea of pressure. So it gets confusing when you think about it as a force, but it makes sense in terms of it has an energy and there's some sort of incident area or volume that it's hitting. And this is actually another interesting thing. So we talk about the expansion of space, and there is also a kind of weird cosmic. So there's two Doppler effects that happen in space. A lot of people don't realize there are two different Doppler effects that happen in space. One of them is proper motion Doppler effect. So that's like if you look at a spiral galaxy edge on, you'll see one side is moving away from you and one side is moving towards you. And this side that's moving towards you will be all blue shifted. And this side that's moving away from you is all red shifted. So it'll literally look like a bluer side and a redder side. And I'll show you this real quick. This is kind of cool. Yeah, let's see if I can find the original. Yeah, so there's a cool thing called the cosmic microwave background. And this is effectively a snapshot of like the beginning of the universe. It's a cool thing to look into. But there are many different versions of this. This is our most recent one. And for various scientific reasons, I don't think we'll ever get a more higher precision version. But anyway, our first version had this weird artifact. And this is blue shifting and red shifting from the Milky Way. So as we're being whipped around the universe, we're seeing the universe getting red shifted and blue shifted. So anyway, this is a Doppler shift from being moved. And then there's cosmological Doppler shifting, which I wonder if I could actually cosmological Doppler. I don't think I'll find an image of it, but yeah, basically the idea is that since the universe is getting, this isn't a bad example. So here's an example where, if it ever loads, where Hubble has looked at a bunch of things, and all of these objects are really distant objects that all happen to be the exact same color. And the reason that they're the exact same color is because they're so distant that they've been Doppler shifted cosmologically, so not by movement or anything like that, just by the universe getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, they got red shifted. And one weird thing, I remember I got into a big debate with a particle physicist about this. He was like, he's a DOD intense particle physicist. He didn't really buy that they were getting red shifted as they transversed the universe. And it is a kind of odd idea that like a star, like a blue star releases its blue photon, and then as it's moving every few years, it's just redder and redder and redder. And that's a kind of odd idea. But one reason that it kind of comes down at a cosmological level is that if the universe is really expanding, then that photon has a certain energy. And if you think of the pressure of the photon that it's exerting, that box that's around that photon is also getting bigger and bigger and bigger with the universe. And it's diluting the photon as the universe grows. And so this is another thing, I'm just tying it back to boundaries, but like cosmological redshift, I believe is a property of boundaries expanding, but that's with the universal growth, and that's a very mysterious thing. I have no answers for that. But yeah.
Wow.
I went that into, yeah.
Well, we have gone around the world today.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this is one of those metaphysics topics that like I feel like I could talk about for hours in many different ways, you know.
Well, maybe next time we should talk about astrophysics, because I have a lot of questions and I'm very interested in this stuff. So
Sure. Yeah. And I also want to give a little caveat real quick, before we wrap up, that, I am but a master's student in physics. Like I don't know all the answers, and I might have certain things wrong and stuff. These are kind of my interpretations of what I've learned. But yeah.
Oh, but I mean, that's where ideas come from, right? I did a whole video on Stephen Wolfram's theory of everything. And I'm not a
There,
physicist.
yeah, yeah, I see. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. So yeah, this is, yeah. I guess my what's it called? Public service announcement wasn't totally necessary, but that's okay.
Well, your other public service announcement is that you're going to be starting a YouTube channel. So if people are interested, they should stay tuned.
Yeah, they should do some searches for Dave Nair, get me up in the algorithm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, Dave. Well, it's great talking to you. And I
All
look.
right. It was great talking to you as
Oh,
well.
you know what? I did want to show you those paintings,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
edges, because I got these things ready. So let me share this real quick, because this whole idea of edges, the way it works out in art is that the art has gone through many different phases, but let's say from the Renaissance onward, there was a long phase in which there was a real focus on realism and trying to get form and shadow as carefully as possible to build 3D images on the canvas. Before that, during the Byzantine era, there was more emphasis on shapes and how shapes fit together. And then going forward into, let's say, the Impressionist era, it was more about the color of light. And then you go into, say, abstract expressionism, it's more into color and shape and emotion, spiritual aspect, like with Kandinsky and so forth. But in recent years, there's been a lot of people playing with foreground and background changing places in the viewer's eyes, so that you're not quite sure what's background, not quite sure what's foreground. And this has to do with the way the edges play together. And so in terms of boundaries, I think it's a very interesting thing to think about, because that also plays out in all the social and psychological and physical arenas. And so I'm going to share some of these pictures here. So so here's one picture that I found interesting. I apologize for Pinterest. It can't get pictures very big, but you can see that, right? So there's these flowers, but the drawing kind of fades into the background in places. The edges kind of fade. But then in other places, he's brought it out with vivid, bright color, right? And here's another example from the same artist, where you see the background and the foreground are changing places. So when you first look, if you were walking into a art gallery and looking at this, your first vision would be, oh, this is just an abstract piece. But when you get right up close to it, there's flowers in there. There's
wow.
There are other ideas in there. So now here's a couple of figures. You see how the artist has made this whole figure.
Oh yeah.
All one big shape with a patterning that it's you can't see the shape of the form at all. It's just a big shape of these two bodies together. But then she's gotten more realistic with the head and the arms and so forth. Here's another one by the same artist. The figures are fading in and out of the background. If you cut this painting off right here, the bottom half would look almost totally just like
totally abstract
piece. Yeah. You wouldn't even know it was a painting of figures, except that you could, down in this corner, you can see this little girl. And of course, I keep losing my home page because I had picked out a bunch of stuff. Now, here is this is more focused on form and delineating the figure from the background, making a very sharp boundary, right? Here's another one where it's there's a lot of focus on color there and pattern, and then just the lines so that the background shows through.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah,
This
so
is so cool.
you can see a lot of different types of styles where people are playing with these edges. Here's another one.
Man, this gives me some idea. I mean, not full-fledged ideas yet, but this is super cool.
Yeah, and let me get back to my home page again. Here is one where they're focusing on the realism of it, and then they're allowing the
Oh, yeah.
wall to come right through the woman, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things that you can do that tell a story and that create a narrative in the viewer's mind, if just by playing with edges and boundaries. Maybe one more. Yeah.
Wow.
So anyway, I did want to show that before we stop, since I had pulled these all up to show you.
This is awesome. This is giving me a lot of cool ideas and stuff too.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you for showing me this. And you know, like I mean, in terms of my own art, I've always liked to experiment with things, but to that same degree, I love seeing other people's really clever little things because I could totally springboard off of that too. So that's great. Yeah.
Well, that's how art moves forward, is people trying out what other people have done before, and
Yep.
and then your own personal, your own identity moves into the art, and so it changes it anyway. So even if you're trying to do exactly what somebody else did before, it's never going to be exactly like theirs. So
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
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 Have a great day.
Cool. All right. You as well. See you. Nice
Bye.
talking. Bye.